I wish I could be like Yes.
Good morning. We ring this bell 3 times. The first is to call us into covenant, to review and rebuild a relationship. We invoke and invite the presence of this land's forebears, those to whom we did wrong and whom trust needs repair. We occupy the unceded land of the Muwakma tribe of the Ohlone people. The second bell calls us into relationship with ourselves and one another, that we open ourselves to the wisdom of diverse array of people and practices, that we learn to invite an ever-widening circle of compassion and commitment until we are all beloved to each other. And the third calls us into relationship with our children and our children's children, out to the 7th generation, helping us to realize that what we do now or fail to do will be felt by those who come after us. Oh, one piece of paper. Okay. Our Unitarian Universalist tradition places great emphasis on reason to interpret our experience, to derive spiritual meaning and ethical guidelines. But engaging our imagination can enrich our religious life as well and open it to wider perspectives. A few years back, I went to a concert by the Gaelic Muses. These are 3 female musicians playing energetic Celtic-inspired music. Alison Klein of our congregation was on the recorder. During one of their amazing pieces, I was transfixed by the impression the music gave of soaring up into the sky. At last, the composition reached the top of the arc and then fell in a most beautiful and peaceful descent, ending in a silence that felt almost healing. For days later, I wondered why this had been so powerful. It occurred to me that the upward spiral was akin to my innermost desire for freedom, to be unencumbered by cares, hurts, or even thoughts. But what did the downward recovery symbolize? It seems that once this exhilarating and expansive overview was enjoyed, I would want to give it all away. Like clouds rising against gravity, at last they drop their rain, nourishing the world that more life may arise. Maybe it's all a picture of freedom, liberty from oppression and attachment as well, where only the pure joy of caring for the world is of concern. To me, this spiritual dynamic remains foundational to something deep inside, to what something deep inside wants my destiny to be. Come, let us worship together. Please join with me in reciting these words which call us together as a community and with Unitarian Universalists all across the globe. We light this chalice to remind ourselves to treat all people kindly, because we are all one family. To take good care of the earth, because it is our home. To live lives full of goodness and love, because that is how we will become the best people we can be.
morning. It's new. Welcome to Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. My name is Suzette Takei, and I'm a member of your board. We're so glad that you've joined us this morning. Unitarian Universalism is a radically inclusive, non-doctrinal, non-dogmatic, open-minded, and open-hearted faith. We are people who are coming at truth from different paths. We gather together across different identities, experiences, and beliefs to affirm and promote the inherent worth of every person. Together, we see the job as to love the hate out of this world, heal the hurt in ourselves and one another, and to be the change we'd like to see in this world. We encourage attendees to be masked inside. We have masks available at the welcome table in the back. Please help yourself. The end of the mask requirement does not mean the end of COVID-19, which will remain present in our community. We are allowing attendees to decide which tools to keep themselves and others as healthy as possible. If you're our guest for the first time, we welcome you. Here's a bit of information on how our hybrid services work. We use chat and Zoom, or our book near the welcome table. And you can share your joys and concerns, personal milestones of importance, which we will read aloud in the service. We also have social hour after the service, where we get to visit with one another in breakout rooms or on the patio. The worship host will give you more information about this after the service. And someone from our membership team will put the link to our weekly newsletter in the chat so that you can see all of the upcoming events. We encourage you to join anything that speaks to you. We do have an in-person potluck on Wednesday this week here in Cole Hall, 6 to 8. So please join us. And that's it. So make sure your mobile devices are silenced, and we're glad to be together today. Thank you.
Are we going to wave?
Oh, yes, I didn't add it. We're waving. Everyone, hello, good morning.
Hello, I'm Reverend Brian Ferguson. I'm the minister at the Universalist Fellowship of Red Tea, and I'm your guest worship leader. Thank you for being here. Thank you to those of you online. It's nice to see you. Oh, they're waving back. How nice. I'm going to do the time for all ages. The idea today is about imagination. This month. And can you hear me okay? Is that good? Okay. Isn't the technology fun? I said I was going to make it tight. It's hard because I'm going to move around today. So, this story is one of my heroes, and it's a Reverend Olympia Brown. And Olympia Brown is an amazing person. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her story. And I think she's a great example of imagining something and then living it. We all want to do or feel like we need to do, given the state of the world right now. Now, Olympia Brown was born in like 1835, and she grew up in a Universalist family. And she really kind of pestered her parents, though they were supportive, for her and her sister to get an education, because women didn't get the same education as men at the time. So she went to one college and she didn't quite like it, but then she transferred to another college. And eventually she went to seminary. She went to Lawrence, the Universalist Seminary. And at that time she met with the president, and he said, well, why do you want to come to seminary? A woman can't be a minister. And she said, yes, I can. And that sums her up, yes, I can. And so she ended up, asking to come in. He said, well, you can come in, but in one of the classes, the men had to remember and then recite their speeches and sermons, whereas as a woman, you need to write it out and read it. And so she got up there to give her speech. She had a sheet in front of her, put it behind her back, and recited it just like the men did. And then she, as the president of the seminary, started to soften up to us. He said, well, we'll give you a degree, but you're never going to get ordained as a minister. Can you imagine what she said? Yes, I can. And so she eventually, graduated and became, there was a congregation in Massachusetts. She showed up as, to do her candidating equivalent, and she applied as, rather than Olympia Brown, Reverend, O. Brown. And so she came, and then they were shocked she was a woman. But they said, well, let's hear you preach. And they were blown away by her. And so they ended up deciding, yes, you can come and we'll ordain you. And she was the first woman in the United States, and probably in the Christian world, I don't know that for sure, but in the United States and North America, that got ordained by the denomination and that congregation. And that was in 1863. She was ordained. Now, you think that would be enough of an achievement, but not for Olympia Brown. She basically, served 2 or 3 different congregations, but then she became very involved in women's suffrage. And she went around Kansas trying to get the vote for women, and they almost did in the 1860s. She still continued basically working in the church in basically Wisconsin, Massachusetts, various Universalist churches. And then she wanted to dedicate her life to getting women the vote. And she campaigned and campaigned and campaigned, and she was good friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all these other great figures in the suffragette movement and the women's suffrage movement. And even in the First World War, she was still protesting. At the age of 83, she was protesting and condemning and basically tearing up speeches of the president outside the speeches, because the women still weren't able to vote during the First World War. And in 1920, when women finally got suffrage, she was 85 and was able to vote. And I think just that imagination she must have had to imagine as a woman she could be a minister, because no one else. She had no role models. And then to believe and dedicate her life for 60 years for women to get the vote, that imagination, I think, is just incredible. So I think when I think of us, like, what do I want to imagine for the future, and what would I dedicate my life to make happen? So Reverend Olympia Brown, one of the first women that got ordained by a Universalist congregation, so it's part of our heritage, and also what in votes. I think she's an amazing person, so I encourage you to. Barbara, I'm sure, knows about her. So if you have any more questions, you can email me or ask her, but she's an amazing, amazing woman and one of our ancestors. So thank you for listening.
So I'm with Julie Gasnon and Yvonne Hughes, and they are members of Mission Peak. And I want to know why. Julie?
I have been a member of Mission Peak for over 10 years. I love Mission Peak because it's my family. And I love everything that they do for the community and for the members. I especially love Sunday morning services when I can see my friends and I can hear the encouraging words from Reverend Greg. It starts my week out beautifully. And do you know what? You can't put a price on that.
Yvonne, you left Fremont, but you're still a member of Mission Peak. Why?
Well, again, as Julie said, the love of community and friendships, and Ron and I joined in 2006. It's been 17 years now, and I've lived here in Yuba City for a couple of years. Ron and I truly enjoyed all the participation we had with the congregation, and I served on several different committees and led pastoral associates. I still have a part of small group ministry, which I love, being at connection with the gals in our ministry group. It's just been a joy to still have the connection with the friends and people that we grew to know and love there in Fremont, that both Ron and I had to leave when we moved. And it's so nice to have that outreach and that connection. And it just means more than anything I could say. It's truly heartfelt joy to be a part of Mission Peak.
And you are, and we're all better together.
Yes.
We take up a collection on Sundays for the simple reason that our purpose in gathering is for more than ourselves. We want to make sure that the ministries that we need, the ones that infuse worth and dignity into our children, our youth, and programs of learning and leadership, and our ministries, of anti-oppression and our work in the larger world are in place to meet the needs of others. We hope you will make a contribution towards these worthy causes by mailing your check to Mission Peak UU congregation at the address on the screen. You can also use the bill pay option in your online banking, or drop your check in the Mission Peak mail slot, or pay online with a credit or debit card. Thank you for supporting and sustaining the efforts of our members, friends, and staff. Your contributions make loving, learning, and leadership more possible.
Good morning. One of the things that allows us to find hope and meaning in the congregation, especially in the hard times, is the love and support that we show each other. If you have a joy or concern that by sharing with the caring community might bring the encouragement or resilience that you need, please write it briefly now in the chat. And if you're here in person, we'd like to place a stone in the garden as the music plays. You can please do that. If your need is personal, you can send an email to Reverend Greg, our minister, or to me for a follow-up conversation. You'll now hear Eleanor Rigby by Peak Rocks.
Oh, look at all the lonely people. Oh, look at all the lonely people. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream, waits at the window, wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door. Who is it for? All the lonely people. Where do they all come from? All the lonely people. Where do they all belong? Father Mackenzie, writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear. No one comes near, look at him working, donning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. What does he care? All the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they all belong? Oh, look at all the lonely people. Oh, look at all the lonely people. Eleanor Rigby died in the church and was buried along with her name. Nobody came. Father Mackenzie wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave. No one was saved. All the lonely, look at all the lonely. Where do they all come from? All the lonely, look at all the lonely. Where do they all belong?
Okay, I'll now share the joys and concerns that are written in the chat. Okay, those were the ones in the chat. And for those in the book, Reverend Barbara is thrilled to learn that her book, Held, Showing Up for Each Other's Mental Health, is now on the Ministerial Fellowship Committee reading list for people being trained to become UU ministers. That's sort of like the highest compliment I could have gotten. Even if I do nothing else in my ministry, it's a success. And now one last stone for all of those joys and concerns that are held in our hearts and yet too tender to tell.
Thank you, Barbara, and congratulations. I truly understand what a big deal that is and thoroughly deserved. So. Invite you all to take a breath as we absorb those joys, breathing in those joys, and breathing out the hardships, the struggles, the suffering. We've got two short readings this morning. They come from a fabulous book called Spiritual Literacy by Frederick and Marianne Broussard. The Buddha was once threatened with death by a bandit called Angulimala. Then be good enough to fulfill my dying wish, said the Buddha. Cut the branch off that tree. One slash of the sword and it was done. What now, said the bandit. Put it back again, said the Buddha. The bandit laughed. You must be crazy to think that anyone can do that. On the contrary, it's you who's crazy, to think that you are mighty because you wound and destroy. That's the task of children. The mighty know how to create and heal. The second reading, also from the Spiritual Literacy. A large truck was moving through an under a railway underpass when it got wedged in between the road and the girders overhead. All the efforts of the experts to extricate proved useless, and the traffic was stalled for miles on both sides. This might have been the road from Pleasanton to Fremont, I'm not sure. And the little boy kept trying to get the attention of the foreman, but was always just pushed away. Finally, in sheer aspiration, the foreman said, I suppose you've come to tell us how to do this job. Yes, said the child. I suggest you let some air out of the tires. The next song is Wake Now My Senses. Please rise as you're willing and able.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow. Giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor, both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiance here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
I'd like to invite you to join me in the spirit of prayer. This comes from a former UUA president Eugene will pick it. For the grandeur of creation, worlds known and unknown, galaxies beyond galaxies, filling us with awe and challenging our imaginations, we give thanks this day. For this fragile planet Earth, its times and tides, its sunsets and imaginations, we give thanks this day. For the joy of human life, its wonder and surprises, its hopes and achievements, we give thanks this day. For our human community, our common past and our future hopes, our oneness transcending all separation, our capacity to work for peace and justice in the midst of hostility and oppression, we give thanks this day. For high hopes and noble causes, for faith without fanaticism, for understanding views not shared, we give thanks this day. For all who have laboured and suffered for a fairer world, who have lived so that others might live with dignity and freedom, we give thanks this day. For human liberty and sacred rights, for opportunities to change and grow, to affirm and choose, for our capacity to care and nurture this planet, our home, we give thanks this day. We pray that we live not by our fears, but by our hopes, not by our words, but by our deeds. I invite you to join me in a time of silence. Blessed be and amen. Awake now my senses, the hymn we had before the prayer, talks about senses as compassion, reason, conscience, and it ends with vision. And I think most of us don't think of those as senses. We think of sight and sound, feel, touch. But I love the Buddhist idea. The Buddhists have this idea that the mind is one of our senses. The mind is one of our senses. And I think of when we start thinking about imagination and what we can imagine, there is a sense that our imaginations can kind of project us into the future, and it can also take us into the past. And our transcendentalist history, which was kind of in the middle to late 19th century, very influential in our Unitarian side of our movement, thought that the divine, the sacred, was best accessed through our intuition and through our mind. So I'm going to use our imagination and ask you to use your imagination. I think we need some Unitarian Universalist saints. And I've got two I'm going to propose to you, St. Paul and St. John. Now, I don't know who you're thinking of, but I'm thinking of Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Because I think they could be Unitarian Universalist saints. And St. John Lennon says this: there are two basic motivating forces, fear and love. When we are afraid, we pull back from life. When we are in love, we are open to all that life offers with passion, excitement, and acceptance. Evolution and all hope for a better world rests in the fearless and open-hearted vision of people who embraced life. Evolution and all hopes for a better world rest in the fearless and open-hearted vision of people who embraced life. That's the words of St. John Lennon. Those are saintly words in my books. That idea of an open-hearted vision, I think that's where we connect our heart with the imagination of our mind. What vision of the future do we want? What vision do we want for our own life as we move forward? I think that's where imagination can play into. And I think as a religious community, we don't often think enough about imagination. And I'm so pleased here at Mission Peak, you're using imagination as a theme for the month. And if you think of imagination as a religious sentiment, and you think of the story I told earlier about Olympia Brown, the imagination she had, like she wanted an education, even though it was not typical for women of her, certainly her class, to get education. Then she wanted to go to seminary, and there was obstacles every way, but she always found a way through her will and through her talent. She was an incredibly talented person, but through mostly her commitment, she was able to make the vision of her imagination a reality in her lifetime. What if we all did that and committed ourselves to it as individuals and as a religious community and as a wider religious movement? But imagination has a shadow side as well, and we can't ignore that. We can often imagine dreadful consequences of the things we do. I mean, I don't know if you remember, if you've ever seen those old maps before they had mapped the world, but there was, in the unknown part, they would write, "There be dragons," in there. You know, yeah, there could be dragons there, but it could also be this beautiful land, there as well. And I think there's also a danger in imagination that we see ourselves not how others see us. And there was a story I really liked from back in 2010 in Arizona, when they brought in the SB 1070 law about racial profiling of Latinos. And there was huge protests there in Arizona that the Unitarian Universalists were very involved in. Our current president of the UUA, Susan Frederick Gray, she was a minister in Arizona and Phoenix and got arrested at the time. So did Peter Morales, our president. But that was when the standing of standing on the side of love, the yellow T-shirts that some of you may own. How many of you own one? I own 3. I'm sure you've got it in your closet somewhere. But this is a wonderful standing on the side of love, and it started off as a marriage equality campaign, but then it really took root with the anti-immigration or the resisting the anti-immigration laws and racial profiling in Arizona. But there was a bunch of Unitarian Universalists standing with the yellow T-shirts, and they all got arrested. And then someone was passing by, and one of my friends was there and heard this passerby saying, "Why are the police arresting a softball team?" Because everyone thought that we were, we were these social justice warriors getting arrested, and someone passing by saw the yellow T-shirts and thought we were a softball team. So imagination doesn't necessarily, it can get you into some strange places as well. But I think a developed, mature, and strong imagination does not make us a daydreamer or impractical. It can strengthen our creative abilities, and it can give us hope to commit ourselves long-term to address the struggles in the world. And Albert Einstein, that well-known religious leader, the physicist, imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world and everything there is that we will know and understand. Imagination is more important than knowledge. And in our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we really put a huge emphasis on the idea of interpreting our lived experience through reason. Now, different religious groups, all of them use the 4 sources like scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. They're all 4 of them are different sources of religious meaning, but we really put the emphasis on interpreting our lived experience through reason. Now, the Catholic tradition obviously uses tradition. Biblical-based Christianity uses scripture. And so everyone uses those to a different degree, but we don't have a strong sense of scripture, or we do. Every one of us here has got a different sense of scripture. But we do have a religious tradition and a religious history that I think is important for us to engage. But I think there's a limit to reason. And we need to be cautious that reason does not take us everywhere, because we can use reason to justify doing bad things. Because I think often how we act as human beings, we choose to do something and then justify it with our reason. There was something emotionally innate that drove us to that. So we need to temper that with, good values. And if you look at children have an incredible imagination. So even when I talk about the maturity of imagination, I think we start with a mature imagination and it becomes less mature as we get older. At least that's been my experience. But I remember there was an experience I had when I was teaching children's RE, and this young girl, she was maybe 6 or 7, she was never very interested in participating, but she attended class. I was kind of worried about it, and then I asked everyone to draw a picture of something that was important to them, and she started getting really enthused about it. I thought, that's interesting. I said, so what are you drawing? And I said, well, I'm drawing a picture of God. That's great. I said, I'm not sure we know what God looks like. She said, they will when I finish this drawing. The confidence of youth. And you heard that with the reading I had with a young child, it said, let the air out the tires. They could see things from a different perspective. And so they could recognize that taking the air out of the tires would help them to lower the truck and unwedge it. So just being able to see things from a different perspective. And that was Albert Einstein's genius as a physicist. My first degree was applied physics, so you've got to excuse me going into the science world here. But his real talent was that kind of these mind games that he would play, and how he developed a relativity idea was he imagined what it would look like. What would it look like if I was in a beam of light? What would I see? Because I'm traveling at the speed of light. So what do you see if you're traveling at the speed of light? And that's how he developed the idea. It was a leap of his imagination. He was never credited with great mathematics. His wife, who never got the credit she deserved, was a great mathematician, at least at the time when he developed his big theories. And then bringing it back to our real world, the world we live in, what are the solutions to the great problems that we have? And what leap of knowledge, of imagination, of creativity would help us to create that world we want, that world without violence, that world without prejudice, that world where we care for the planet we live in. We look at the world around us, the conflict in Israel, Palestine, it's been going on for years, the more recent conflict in Ukraine with the invasion by the Russians. Just the tragedy of violence in our own neighbourhoods, in our own country, and by violence I mean both physical violence, but the mental, emotional and spiritual violence. So much part of the world. That is what drives me in my ministry. How can we overcome the prevalent violence throughout the world? And of course, we've had the huge disruption of COVID. I know this congregation's been impacted, as my congregation in Redwood City's been impacted. And it's been a huge disruption, but it's also opened us up to new ideas like hybrid worship for those on there. That was something that many of us thought about doing, but were forced into. That was a disruption that was forced onto us. What disruption, having been unsettled by that, what leap of imagination would we like to take next? And can we imagine a world that we're willing to commit ourselves to? And Unitarian Universalism is going through a change right now, and I'm not sure how much Reverend Greg's talked to you about the Article 2, the replacement for the 7 principles. And I'm a fan. I know people have got different opinions, but I think it's recognizing what we are, because we've really put love at the center of our religion, and I think that's where we have been. I mentioned Olympia Brown, who's our Universalist minister. The key distinction, the key principle of our Universalist tradition was putting the love of all humanity at the center of the religion. the love of all humanity. They moved away and rebelled against the Calvinist idea of a punishing God to a loving God, and that we'd all be saved. And whether the ideas of heaven and hell, again, they gave up on the literal ideas 200 years ago. What universalism did say was we all had a common future. And that's radically egalitarian and incredibly powerful. So I think the fact we put love at the centre is really strong. And of course, we've got those 6 other values. But putting the love of all humanity can be a challenge. I want to go through a mind exercise with you, an exercise of your imagination. And this comes from Robert Thurman, the Buddhist. He's a professor at Columbia University. And he says, imagine someone that personifies your idea of evil, of wrongdoing. And in this exercise, we think of Adolf Hitler. I think most of us can agree that was someone who caused great destruction and harm in the world. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. Imagine him in whatever your definition of hell is, and thinking and seeing him punished and in pain and agony and suffering eternally. And check your emotions around that. And then here's another exercise. Imagine Adolf Hitler in the lotus position, looking at all the death and destruction he caused, and crying and repenting for. And look at your own emotions around that. It's not whether it's true what is going to happen, but I don't know if you see a shift in your own emotions. The first one is like vengeance, yes, got them. And it gets into a kind of the darker side of who we are. Even seeing someone like that, imagining someone like that repenting, it might just soften our hearts a little bit and say, yeah, maybe I can't quite hold them in love, but I can sense some dignity and worth of it. And of course, that's an extreme example, someone like that. I think that's the challenge of our universalist tradition of holding everyone in love. And when we hold everyone in love, it does not mean we like everyone. And I love to say to my congregation, we hold everyone in love, but we hold some further away than others. But we hold everyone in love because everyone has worth and dignity. And that's a challenge. That's not easy. It can be an easy thing to say, but it's not an easy thing to do in practice. So rather than taking such an extreme example in Adolf Hitler, look into your own life. What examples in your own life? Maybe you've had a falling out with a family member, a child, a neighbour, perhaps a church member. How have you fallen out? And can you imagine making a speech or an apology? Can you imagine them apologising to you? Can you imagine repairing that relationship? Can you hold them in enough love that you want to commit to moving forward your relationship with them? I think that's what our Unitarian Universalist faith calls us to do. And I don't for a moment say it's easy. But we need our imagination to move from that place of judgment of someone else to that place of curiosity, of understanding, and of repairing that relationship. So that's at the individual level, but we look around the world, and the world needs a huge amount of repair. And I think that comes through us being able to imagine a better world and commit ourselves to it. And the Russian philosopher Nikolai Beredev says, bread for myself is a material question. Bread for my neighbour is a spiritual one. Bread for myself is a material question. Bread for my neighbour is a spiritual one. So imagination is not just about thinking outside the box, it's about living outside the box. I want to give you an example that's a really important example for how I engage my work. Elise Boulding was a Quaker sociologist, and she's got this idea of the 200-year now, or the long present. She said we should really think in terms of 200 years. And I noticed in your welcome, you sort of talked about 7 generations, and this is a little bit similar to that idea. But the idea of thinking in a 200-year now, that whatever we do here will have an impact 200 years in the future, and we're impacted by 100 years in the future, and we're impacted by 100 years in the past. To help you understand it, I want to give you an example from my life. My maternal grandmother was born in 1900, 1st of January 1900. I so wanted her to make it to the year 2000 because she'd have been 100 that time. She made it to 93, which was pretty good. And she grew up in this, my family's coal mining back in west of Scotland. And she grew up in a coal mining village, as my mother did. And I remember her. She died when I was 31, so I knew her quite well. I grew up with her. I'd love to say she was a kind, generous, insightful person. She could be. She was a religious bigot. She was racist. She was actually sexist. My mother was a valedictorian of a high school. None of her family had gone to college. My gran stopped her at the opportunity going to college. But she did love me, and I know that. And so I think of this idea. She was born in 1900. I imagine this picture of her holding my mother's hand, holding my hand, holding my daughter's hand, who was born in 2003, and then her child, who could be born in 2030, perhaps. She's not got high hopes at the moment. It's 2030. And so her child will last, should live till 2100. So we're just links in the chain from I'm just a link in the chain from 1900 to 2100. These are people whose hands I've held, who've influenced me. And I think if we each think of that, when were you born? What connection? Who's the oldest person you can remember influencing you? And who's the youngest person that you will influence? That's probably going to span 200 years. So what we do in this room now will impact 100 years from now. That's 2123. So that idea of Olympia Brown taking 60 years working in women's suffrage, and of course there was women that probably worked 140 years before that to make that happen, people who influenced her. So I think if we use that imagination, like we're working towards 2023, and we can influence. And the great thing about a religious community is we're an intergenerational community. An intergenerational community. So we'll be influencing 2123 by what we do, and just as we are influenced by 1923. So I think if we think in those terms in the imagination, and that idea of 7 generations, which comes from many Native Americans, if we think more long term, it's not about success today. My hope is that I can eradicate spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical violence by 2123. I won't be around, but that's what motivates me to do it. I think that idea of the 200-year now and the long presence is a really powerful idea, because that's how we can make that change to human history. And you think what Unitarian Universalism as a movement has done. I've talked about women's suffrage. We're very big, and most, especially Universalists, and to some degree the Unitarians, are very influential in the abolition of slavery. We've done tremendous work in the LGBTQ. And now we're really engaged in the anti-racism work and environmental work. I mean, religion was actually quite slow in getting into environmental work, but that's a big part of who we are now with the Ministry for the Earth. And we think of slavery being dead now, but with human trafficking, there's still much slavery in the world. So these are all things, whatever your passion is, work on it and look like, what do I want to do now to have an impact 100 years in the future? It may be mentoring, it may be mentored, depending on your age. I think that is the kind of frame we need to do, because we're not going to solve the environmental problems, the anti-racism problems, the inequality problems, the violence in the world today or in the foreseeable future, but we start working towards that long term. So the meaningful religious life is to live out our imaginations and have a vision of the world that we want in the future. So I'd like to offer this prayer for each of us, that we yoke our imagination to the common good and dedicate to find a way to do something good and creative out into the world, something life-affirming, life-enhancing, and perhaps even life-saving. That is how we'll create a vision for a better world, where war is not the result of a lack of imagination, but it's a last resort after everything else has been tried and failed. A world where addressing global warming is part of everyone's life and every government is committed to addressing it. Where everyone in a community has their basic needs met, where all people are judged by the contents of their character and not the colour of their skin, as Martin Luther King preached then. He never came up with a proposition. He said, I have a dream. It wasn't an idea, it was a dream. That his children, his 4 children, would be judged by the colour, not by the colour of the skin, but the content of their character. When women and people who are non-binary have the same opportunity and pay as men, and women are not sexually objectified by our media. Where concerns about sexual orientations and gender diversity are a thing of the past and put into the trash heap of history. Where can we engage our own suffering and with a leap of imagination connect with our highest hopes, transforming our own pain to a path of healing and repair? Now, having imagined that world, let us envision how to make it so by pledging our hearts, our minds, and our actions to make our vision a reality and working it together. And perhaps, as St. John Lennon said, someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. I invite you to rise in body and spirit for our final hymn, Turn the World Around, 1074.
We come from the fire, living in the fire, go back to the fire, turn the world around. We come from the water, living in the water, go back to the water, turn the world around. We come from the mountain, living on the mountain, go back to the mountain, turn the world around. Oh, so is life. Ah, so is life. So is life. Ah, so world around. Heart is of the river, body is the mountain, spirit is the sunlight, turn the world around. We are of the Spirit, truly of the Spirit, only can the Spirit turn the world around. Oh, so is life now, so is life. Oh, so is life now, so is life. Oh, so is life now, so is life. Whoa, so is life now, so is life.
Please join me, with me in reciting these words to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. It's a tough one. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for having me here. It's been my great pleasure to be with you today. I invite you to imagine. Imagine the future you want. Imagine the repaired relationship you want. Imagine the world you want to have for yourself, for your children, for your children's children, for those 7 generations that you asked for. What would you like to commit yourself to do now? Because we as a religion, we are life-affirming, we are life-enhancing, we are life-saving religion, where we believe in the love of all humanity. We place the love of all humanity at the center of our religion. And how do we want to make that a reality in the world? I ask you as you leave, go with love, go in love. Blessed be, and amen.